Iran's leadership is running out of directions to look. Not metaphorically, actually, physically. Every single exit they could have used to escape this war with any shred of leverage has been sealed off one at a time over the past several months, and what's left is a regime that is being squeezed from the sea, from the sky, from its own economy, and now from inside its own borders all at once. This isn't a single knockout blow, and it was never going to be. This is a trap built in layers, closing slower and tighter with every week that passes. And right now, for the first time since this entire conflict began, it looks like there might not be a way out left for the mullahs at all. Understanding exactly how each of those layers works and how they reinforce each other, rather than operating in isolation, is the difference between watching this war as a string of disconnected headlines and actually seeing the strategy underneath all of it. Let's start with the layer that's been running the longest and doing the most quiet damage: the naval blockade across the Strait of Hormuz. This isn't some symbolic gesture. This is a full operational chokehold on the single most important oil transit point on the planet, and it has been running for months now without any meaningful interruption. American boarding teams have continued working through this entire war, going over the rail on vessels suspected of moving Iranian oil or violating the terms of the blockade, inspecting cargo, and either clearing ships to continue or turning them away outright. Reports from the stretch of the operation describe a dozen vessels redirected, several disabled, and multiple boarded and inspected directly at sea, all while Iran has been effectively unable to move meaningful volumes of crude out through the strait. Even during periods when the bombing campaign against Iran has gone quiet, even during declared pauses in the airstrikes, the blockade has never stopped. That's the part people keep missing when they hear about a pause in hostilities and assume the pressure is easing. It isn't. A blockade doesn't need bombers in the sky to keep squeezing an economy. It just needs ships in the water, and those ships have kept working every single day of this conflict. And that squeeze has been devastating in ways that go well beyond a temporary dip in export revenue. Iran's economy was already fragile heading into this war, and months of sanctions layered on top of a blockade that's choking off its primary source of foreign currency have pushed the country into a position where its own leadership has had to publicly acknowledge the strain. The White House itself has framed the sequencing plainly, pointing to sanctions that have crippled Iran's economy running in parallel with a sustained military campaign, arguing that the combination has left Iran negotiating from a position where it genuinely has very little left to bargain with. That's not just political spin, it's a fairly accurate description of the math. When a country can't sell its oil, can't access its own frozen assets, and is hemorrhaging money on a war it's losing on nearly every front, the pressure compounds in a way that becomes almost impossible to escape. Without either a genuine negotiated settlement or a level of internal upheaval the regime has spent decades trying to avoid. This isn't a hypothetical risk for Tehran either. It's already happened once during this exact stretch of hardship. Iran experienced significant public protests over the past year directly tied to economic conditions. Unrest serious enough that Iranian security forces responded with the kind of violent crackdown that's become the regime's default answer whenever domestic anger threatens to spiral into something larger. Reports and statements from officials tracking the situation describe tens of thousands of protesters killed by Iranian government forces over recent months, a number that has reportedly slowed since this current phase of the war intensified, but never actually dropped to zero. That tells you something important about how this regime operates when it's cornered. It doesn't negotiate with its own population, it suppresses them, and every additional month of economic strain from the blockade increases the odds that suppression alone won't be enough to keep a lid on public anger the next time it boils over. A government that has to keep killing its own citizens just to maintain order at home is not a government operating from a position of strength, no matter how it tries to project that strength on state television. Now layer the air campaign on top of that economic strangulation, because this is where the trap gets its teeth. Over a stretch of 13 consecutive nights, American airpower hit more than 300 targets across Iran in just the first 3 nights alone, with reports of roughly 140 targets struck in a single evening at the height of the campaign. Missile launch sites, drone storage bunkers, naval assets, and munitions depots across the coastline near the Strait of Hormuz, locations like Bandar Abbas, Kharg Island, and Jask, all took sustained, repeated hits. Coastal defense positions and cruise missile sites on islands like Greater Tunb were pounded as well, specifically because Iran spent years building bunkers deep into hillsides and underground storage facilities, betting that burying their ballistic missile stockpile deep enough would keep it safe from anything the outside world could throw at it. That bet just failed badly because of one specific weapon that finally proved capable of reaching exactly what Iran thought it had hidden for good. That weapon is the GBU-72, officially the Advanced 5K Penetrator, a 5,000-pound class precision-guided bunker-busting bomb that saw its first ever combat use in this exact war. It combines a hardened, penetrating warhead with GPS and inertial guidance, giving it the ability to punch through layers of rock and concrete before detonating deep inside a target, rather than simply cratering the surface above it, which is the entire difference between damaging a bunker and actually destroying everything stored inside it. Only 2 aircraft in the entire American arsenal are even cleared to carry this weapon, the B-1B Lancer and the F-15E Strike Eagle, and the B-1B in particular has become the workhorse of this campaign, capable of hauling up to 75,000 pounds of payload, the largest conventional bomb load of any bomber in the Air Force inventory. Alongside it rides the smaller GBU-31, a 2,000-pound JDAM built around a penetrator warhead of its own, used extensively against ballistic missile production facilities, underground command centers, and mobile launchers throughout this campaign. None of that firepower gets anywhere near Iranian soil, though, without a suppression layer clearing the way first, F-22s, F-35s, and EA-18G Growlers tearing a hole through Iran's air defense network before a single bomber can even approach its target. In terms of where it sits in America's broader arsenal, the GBU-72 occupies a very deliberate middle ground. It's more powerful than the aging GBU-28 it effectively replaces, but it's still dramatically lighter and more flexible than the 30,000-pound GBU-57, the massive ordnance penetrator that requires a B-2 Spirit to carry it and is reserved for the deepest, most hardened targets on the planet, the kind of weapon that gets mentioned specifically in connection with Iran's most fortified remaining nuclear-adjacent mountain facilities. The GBU-72 was built to achieve comparable effects using fewer weapons at a lower cost per round, which matters enormously in a campaign firing off 300 targets in 3 nights. In a fight this large, efficiency isn't a footnote. It's the entire logistical backbone that makes a campaign of this scale sustainable night after night, without running out of munitions before the enemy runs out of targets. Put all of that together and you get exactly what we've watched happen repeatedly across this war. Fireballs erupting straight up through solid ground as bunkers that were supposed to be untouchable turn out to be nothing more than concrete chimneys, funneling the full force of an explosion directly up through the earth the moment the right weapon finally finds them. And Iran's own ballistic missile arsenal, the thing this entire bunker-busting campaign has been aimed at, has been cut down dramatically as a result. Estimates that once put Iran's stockpile somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 missiles now suggest something closer to 1,500 to 2,000 remaining, a significant reduction achieved in a matter of months rather than years. Iran's naval capability has taken a comparable beating, with well over 100 vessels reported destroyed or damaged across the course of this conflict. This is a military that's being dismantled piece by piece in full public view, night after night, with the footage of each strike serving almost as proof of concept for how thoroughly this campaign has worked. So when American officials talk about pausing the bombing campaign, and there have genuinely been stretches where the strikes stopped entirely for a night or more, it's worth understanding exactly why that pause happens and what it actually signals. The president has been fairly direct about this himself, describing a posture where talks are ongoing, where Iran is described as getting more serious as the days go by, and where the American side remains, in his own words, locked and loaded and ready to go if talks fail to produce results. That's not a sign of weakness or hesitation. It's leverage being deliberately held in reserve. A government that pauses a devastating campaign specifically to give an adversary one more chance to negotiate, while simultaneously keeping the blockade running and keeping strike plans ready to restart at a moment's notice, is a government that believes it has already won the military argument and is now just waiting to see whether the economic and psychological pressure is enough to close the deal without needing to fire another shot. But here's where the trap gets a second jaw. Because even while the airstrikes have paused at various points, the planning for something far more direct hasn't stopped at all. According to reporting citing multiple American officials, the Pentagon has been actively preparing plans for weeks of ground operations inside Iran, and thousands of additional troops have already been flowing into the region to support exactly that kind of escalation, if it's ordered. This isn't being described as a full-scale invasion of the country. Nobody serious is suggesting an occupation of all 90 million Iranians is on the table, but it does involve a mixture of special operations raids and conventional infantry operations focused on specific, high-value coastal targets. One location that keeps coming up again and again in this planning is Kharg Island, and if you don't recognize that name, you should, because Kharg Island is where Iran loads the overwhelming majority of its crude oil exports. It is, in almost every practical sense, the financial heart of the regime. If American or Allied forces were ever to seize or disable that island, even temporarily, you're not just degrading a military asset, you're reaching directly into the exact revenue stream that funds the IRGC, funds what's left of the missile program, and funds every proxy militia Iran has spent decades building across the region. That is not a symbolic target. That is an artery. And the fact that it's sitting on an active planning list tells you exactly how seriously this option is being treated behind closed doors. The honest math on what a genuine ground invasion would require is still enormous, worth remembering even amid all this pressure. Iran fields somewhere around 350,000 active duty personnel in its regular army, plus roughly 190,000 more inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, bringing total active duty manpower to something like 570,000 troops, with another 350,000 trained reservists available for mobilization, and a paramilitary Basaji network that could theoretically add several 100,000 more bodies in a full wartime scenario. Occupying a country with that kind of manpower and a population above 90 million would require a commitment north of 100,000 troops and months of sustained logistics, which is exactly why what's actually being planned looks far more like a targeted campaign against specific coastal choke points than anything resembling full occupation. But even a limited raid on something as symbolically and economically central as Kharg Island represents an entirely different category of pressure than another night of airstrikes, because it puts American boots directly on Iranian soil, directly in range of the exact insurgent tactics, IED specifically, that Iranian-backed networks spent years perfecting and exporting across Iraq and Afghanistan. That risk is real, and it's precisely why officials have been careful to describe this as an option being prepared, rather than a decision that's already been made. But prepared options that involve moving thousands of troops into theater and drawing up detailed plans against a country's most valuable piece of oil infrastructure are not bluffs. They're a second closing jaw on a trap that already has the first jaw, the naval blockade, and a third jaw, the bunker-busting air campaign, already locked in place. And then there's the fourth pressure point, the one that might ultimately matter more than any of the others, because it's happening from the inside rather than from the outside, and it's one most casual observers of this war have barely noticed. Back in February, 5 armed Kurdish political factions inside Iran, the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, known as PAK, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, known as PJAK, the Organization of Iranian Kurdistan Struggle, known as Khabat, and the Komala of the Toilers of Kurdistan, did something they had never managed to do before in their long, fractured history. They formed a single coalition with one explicit, publicly stated goal: toppling the Islamic Republic and achieving self-determination for Iran's Kurdish population. Every one of these groups has actual combat experience stretching back decades, with organized Peshmerga forces, some of them, like PAK, trained directly by the American military during the war against ISIS. This wasn't formed as some symbolic gesture either. Within days of announcing the coalition, a senior figure inside the group stated publicly that a large force was already positioned inside Iran and that military action would begin as soon as possible. And Iran responded by launching preemptive missile and drone strikes against Kurdish positions across the border in Iraq, hitting the exact bases these fighters operate out of. Since then, Iran has carried out roughly 200 separate strikes against Kurdish-linked positions in Iraqi Kurdistan, and actual armed clashes have broken out repeatedly inside Iran's own western provinces, including a firefight near Piran that left at least 6 Kurdish Peshmerga fighters dead according to their own party's confirmation, with Iran claiming a similar number of Kurdish militants killed on their side of the count. What makes this fourth front so significant is who's been paying attention to it. President Trump personally called the leaders of multiple Kurdish factions early in this war, including Masoud Barzani and Bafel Talabani, the 2 most powerful Kurdish leaders in Iraq, and separately called Mustafa Hijri, the head of the newly formed Iranian Kurdish coalition itself. Analysts describe that specific call as an extraordinary development, elevating the standing of Iran's Kurds in a way that hadn't been seen before and signaling just how seriously Washington was treating them as a genuine fighting force inside this conflict. Reporting also indicates that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had spent months lobbying behind the scenes to put Kurdish forces at the center of American strategy, drawing on decades of close Israeli intelligence relationships with Kurdish groups across the region, with one source close to those discussions describing the belief that the Kurds would rise up once the war began as very much Netanyahu's own personal conviction. The strategic model being floated draws a direct comparison to how American airpower worked hand-in-hand with local ethnic minority fighters to topple the Taliban back in 2001, using local forces to do the ground fighting while American bombs clear the way, sparing Washington the political cost of a massive conventional ground invasion. Now, this fourth front isn't without its own real complications, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. There's been visible friction even between Washington and the Kurdish coalition itself, including a public dispute where the president accused Kurdish fighters of essentially stealing weapons that had been sent to arm them, complaining that only a small quantity had actually reached the intended fighters. There's also a genuinely awkward diplomatic balancing act at play, because the Kurds have a historically hostile relationship with Turkey, a NATO ally Washington has to manage carefully in everything it does across this region. And there's internal rivalry too, with reported tension between this Kurdish coalition and a separate Iranian exile opposition camp led by Reza Pahlavi, the son of Iran's last Shah, who has positioned himself as a potential alternative post-regime leader and apparently wasn't thrilled about a rival power center emerging among the Kurds. None of that changes the fundamental fact that Iran is now fighting a documented, sustained, casualty-producing insurgency along its entire western border at the exact same time it's trying to defend against American airpower, hold together its coastal defenses, and manage a naval blockade strangling its economy. Every missile, every drone, and every unit Tehran has to divert towards suppressing Kurdish fighters in Piranshar or Sardasht is a missile, a drone, and a unit that isn't available to defend against the next wave of strikes coming from the sky or the sea. It's worth being honest that this pressure hasn't come free for the American side either, and that cost is part of what makes the ground invasion threat so credible rather than just theater. This war has already claimed American lives, including service members killed in an Iranian strike on a base in Jordan, an attack that reportedly crossed a line the administration had privately drawn as a trigger for exactly the kind of intensified campaign that followed. The dead were honored publicly, with a formal dignified transfer and flag-draped transfer cases met on the tarmac. A reminder that every escalation being discussed in strategy sessions carries a very real human cost on both sides. That cost is precisely why the ground invasion planning has been kept deliberately narrow in scope rather than expanding into anything resembling a full occupation. And it's also exactly why the credible threat of it matters so much as a negotiating tool. A limited raid against a target like Kharg Island risks American casualties from exactly the kind of IED and ambush tactics Iranian-backed networks have spent decades refining. But the alternative, allowing Iran's regime to simply wait out the current pressure and rebuild once the world's attention moves elsewhere, carries its own long-term cost that officials on the American side appear unwilling to accept. That tension between the risk of further ground engagement and the risk of letting this pressure campaign stall out incomplete is exactly the kind of pressure that tends to accelerate decisions rather than delay them indefinitely. There's also a regional dimension to this trap that extends well beyond Iran's own borders, because Tehran isn't just fighting the United States and its own internal uprising, it's watching its broader network of regional partnerships fray at the exact moment it needs them most. Gulf partner nations have taken direct hits from Iranian retaliatory strikes throughout this conflict, and the diplomatic fallout from those attacks has pushed several of them further into alignment with the American-led pressure campaign rather than positioning themselves as neutral mediators the way Iran clearly hoped they would. Reports throughout this war have described Iran quietly pressuring countries like Qatar and Egypt to publicly propose ceasefire terms on its behalf, an attempt to make any pause in fighting look like it originated from independent regional diplomacy rather than desperation inside Tehran itself. That kind of maneuvering only works if the countries being leaned on are willing to play along. And the deeper this war drags on, with Iranian strikes continuing to hit shipping and regional infrastructure, the harder it becomes for any of Iran's remaining regional relationships to serve as a genuine lifeline, rather than just another pressure point working against the regime's interests. There's a sixth thread worth understanding too, because it shows just how far this pressure has spread beyond Iran's own borders and into the reach of its allies. Russia has reportedly been providing Iran with increased targeting assistance throughout this war, not just help refining ballistic missile guidance, but broader intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support as well, according to statements from Ukrainian leadership pointing directly at this cooperation. The logic behind that alliance isn't hard to follow. Every additional day American resources stay tied up, focused on Iran, is a day of reduced attention on Ukraine, and every Patriot interceptor missile burned, shooting down an Iranian ballistic missile over the Persian Gulf is one less interceptor available for Ukraine to use against a Russian missile aimed at Kyiv. That connection became impossible to ignore when Romanian air defenses shot down 3 separate drones over 3 consecutive days along the border with Ukraine, with officials identifying at least one of them as a Shahed-type munition. The exact same Iranian-designed platform Russia has used relentlessly throughout its own war. Iran and Russia propping each other up across 2 completely separate theaters at once tells you something important. It tells you neither regime believes it can survive this level of pressure entirely on its own anymore, which is exactly the kind of desperation that shows up right before a trap finally springs shut, rather than before either side finds a way out of it. There's one more shift worth understanding, because it changes the entire calculation Iran has to make every time it considers striking back. Early in this war, Iran could reasonably expect that any attack it launched would be met with something roughly proportional, a strike for a strike, a ship for a ship. That calculation no longer holds. At one point, the administration made clear that any Iranian strike on a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, whether by missile, rocket, or drone, would be answered by the destruction of a bridge or a power plant inside Iran. A direct, explicit tit for tat tied to infrastructure the regime actually depends on to function. Secretary of State Marco Rubio went further still, describing the American doctrine as something closer to a head for an eye rather than an eye for an eye, meaning whatever Iran spends on an attack, the American response costs more and simply doesn't scale down to match. That's not a subtle shift in rhetoric. It's a formal declaration that the old rules of proportional retaliation no longer apply, and it removes one of the only tools Iran had left for managing this conflict on its own terms. When a regime can no longer predict that a small provocation will draw a small response, every decision it makes becomes exponentially riskier, and that uncertainty alone does as much to box Iran in as any single strike or blockade action. So step back and look at everything converging on Tehran simultaneously. A naval blockade that has been running uninterrupted for months, choking off the oil revenue the regime depends on to fund everything else it does. An air campaign that has proven, with a brand new class of bunker-busting weapon making its combat debut in this exact war, that even Iran's deepest, most heavily fortified missile storage sites are no longer safe from being found and destroyed. A ground invasion option that's been actively planned, resourced, and aimed squarely at the single most economically vital piece of Iranian infrastructure on the map, with thousands of troops already positioned to execute it if diplomacy fails, and an internal armed uprising along Iran's entire western border, backed by direct engagement from the President of the United States himself, forcing the regime to fight a two-front war against its own population at the exact moment it's trying to hold together everything else. Any one of these pressures alone would be a serious problem for a government already this strained. All four running at the same time, reinforcing each other, each one making the others harder to manage, is what a genuine strategic trap actually looks like in practice. Not a single dramatic knockout moment, but a slow, methodical closing of every possible escape route until negotiation becomes the only rational option left. And that's really the honest read on where this stands right now. Total defeat doesn't necessarily mean tanks rolling into Tehran or the regime formally surrendering on television, and anyone promising that outcome is exactly imminent is getting ahead of what the actual reporting supports. What it does mean, based on everything converging at once, is a regime that has lost the ability to control its own narrative, lost a meaningful share of its military capability, lost access to the oil revenue that funds its survival, lost the old rulebook that once let it calculate its own retaliation without fear of a wildly disproportionate response, and is now fighting for its own territorial control against an organized armed movement inside its own borders, all while its only remaining ally is stretched thin, propping up its own war on a completely different continent. That is not a position from which any government negotiates from strength. That's a position from which a government negotiates because every alternative has already been closed off, one deliberate layer at a time, because the cost of waiting any longer only keeps climbing with each passing week. What happens from here likely comes down to a handful of pressure points worth watching closely in the weeks ahead. Does the blockade keep holding tight enough to prevent Iran from finding any workaround for its oil exports? Because every barrel that doesn't reach a buyer is another day the economic clock keeps ticking against the regime. Does the ground invasion option targeting Kharg Island actually get triggered? Or does the credible threat of it alone prove to be enough leverage to push negotiations further without a single additional American boot needing to touch Iranian soil? Does the Kurdish coalition decide the moment has finally come to formally declare a coordinated offensive, rather than continuing this pattern of localized clashes and public denials? And does Washington manage to smooth over its own friction points with that coalition well enough to keep it functioning as a coherent, reliable partner, rather than fracturing under the weight of competing interests? Does the shift toward disproportionate retaliation actually hold Iran back from further strikes on shipping and regional bases? Or does it eventually provoke exactly the kind of desperate, high-risk lash-out that authoritarian regimes sometimes attempt when they conclude they have nothing left to lose by escalating rather than negotiating? And does Iran's leadership, facing pressure on every conceivable front simultaneously, make a strategic miscalculation somewhere in this stretch that accelerates a collapse none of these pressures alone could have caused? The kind of overreach authoritarian regimes have made throughout history, right at the exact moment they were closest to actually surviving a crisis. None of those questions have certain answers yet, and treating any single outcome as guaranteed would be dishonest, given how many moving pieces are still in play. But the shape of what's happening is no longer ambiguous. This is not a war being fought on one front with occasional pauses for diplomacy. This is a coordinated, multi-layered campaign where the naval blockade, the bunker-busting air campaign, the ground invasion planning, and the Kurdish uprising are all reinforcing each other at the exact same time, each one closing off a different avenue Iran might otherwise have used to escape the consequences of this war. That's not something that happens by accident. That's what a trap looks like when it's actually working. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think this combination of pressure, the blockade, the bunker busters, the invasion planning, and the Kurdish front is actually enough to force a genuine collapse or negotiated surrender from Tehran? Or do you think this regime has weathered worse before and will find some way to bleed this out longer than anyone currently expects? Drop your honest take in the comments below, because there's real disagreement among people who follow this conflict closely, and I'd rather hear where you land than assume everyone sees it the same way. If this breakdown helped you actually understand how all these separate fronts connect into one bigger strategic picture, instead of just tracking each headline in isolation, go ahead and hit like on this one. It genuinely helps detailed analysis like this reach more people trying to understand what's actually happening, rather than just scrolling past another clip out of context. Subscribing means you won't miss it the moment any one of these pressure points shifts, whether that's the blockade tightening further, the ground option actually getting greenlit, or the Kurdish coalition finally declaring the offensive its own leadership has already hinted is coming. And if you know anyone who's been following this war but only catching the airstrike headlines without realizing just how many other fronts are closing in at the same time, share this with them, because the full picture here is a lot bigger and a lot more decisive than most coverage is actually showing. Thanks for sticking with this all the way through. Stay close, because a trap this many layers deep does not stay quiet for long once the last piece finally clicks into place. And given the pace this war has moved at over just the past few months, that next shift could come far sooner than most people watching from the outside currently expect.